Hello, everyone, and welcome to Vale of Hearts, a place where love finds its way through the quietest corners of the soul. Tonight's story isn't just about love, it's about distance. The kind that exists between two souls who were never supposed to meet, and yet couldn't stay apart once they did. She was Clara, a quiet librarian who believed passion only lived inside the pages she shelved every day. And he was Rowan, a powerful billionaire who had everything: wealth, success, control, except peace. One rainy afternoon in Portland, when thunder rolled across the city and the world seemed to slow down, fate locked them inside the same forgotten library. Between the whisper of falling rain and the golden light slipping through old windows, their eyes met, and something shifted. It wasn't fireworks. It wasn't fate shouting from the sky. It was quieter, the kind of connection that makes your heart forget how to breathe. From that moment on, nothing felt the same. But when love dares to cross the fragile line between silence and chaos, between reason and desire, how far would you go to protect it? This is the distance we can't name. The rain in Portland wasn't gentle that afternoon. It fell steady and cold, tracing silver lines across the tall arched windows of the old university library. Inside, the world was quiet except for the soft shuffle of pages and the low hum of the storm outside. The smell of rain mixed with the scent of aging paper, a perfume of nostalgia only a place like this could hold. Clara Monroe stood on the upper level, her dark sweater dusted with fine flecks of sunlight that slipped through the glass. She was shelving books, stretching on her toes to reach the higher shelves. Her fingers brushed the worn spines tenderly, as if the stories inside were fragile hearts she needed to protect. She didn't notice the man who had just entered below. Rowan Hale moved with the quiet precision of someone used to being watched. But here, for once, no one cared who he was. Not the billionaire with headlines at his heels. Not the man whose name filled newspapers with numbers and power. He had escaped a swarm of cameras after a conference downtown, his driver still waiting somewhere in the rain. All he wanted was silence. Something real. Something untouched by noise or negotiation. He took off his coat, damp at the edges, and wandered between the aisles. The world of wood and whisper felt foreign yet oddly calming. When he reached the philosophy section, he stopped, because there she was. Clara, balanced on the tips of her boots, was reaching for a thick, leather-bound book. A small tower of volumes wobbled in her arms. Rowan took a step forward, his voice low but steady. "Let me help you with that," she startled, turning quickly. The book slipped. The sound echoed, a tumble of history crashing to the floor. They both knelt at once. Her fingers met his over the same book, skin brushing skin. The moment was quick but charged, like touching a live wire that hummed instead of burned. For the first time in days, Rowan forgot about the world outside. He looked at her, soft hazel eyes framed by a few strands of hair that had fallen loose. She looked nothing like the women he usually met. No designer clothes, no sharp smile hiding ulterior motives. Just warmth and quiet surprise. "I'm so sorry," she murmured, cheeks flushing. "Don't be," he replied. His voice carried a weight she couldn't quite name. "I should have warned you before sneaking up on someone with an armful of history." She let out a nervous laugh. "Well, history doesn't like surprises." He smiled faintly, holding up the book they'd both reached for. "The Impermanence of Things. Seems appropriate for a day like this." Clara tilted her head. "I like that one. It reminds me that everything fades. Cities, storms, even pain. Only emotions seem to last longer than they should." Her words lingered in the air. Rowan's gaze softened. "You talk about impermanence as if it's a kind of peace." "Maybe it is," she said quietly. "If nothing lasts forever, then neither does loneliness." That line hit him deeper than he expected. For years he had built walls of glass and ambition, pretending they were protection. But now, in this dusty library, a stranger's words had found the one crack left. They talked longer than either intended, about old books, forgotten poets, the kind of love stories that end in silence rather than drama. Her voice carried warmth, curiosity, and something he hadn't heard in a long time: sincerity. She didn't ask what he did, didn't try to impress him. She simply listened. When the storm began to ease, he realized he didn't want to leave. There was a stillness in her that matched the chaos inside him. He glanced toward the window, then back at her. "You know," he said after a pause, "I've always had this distance inside me, from my head to my heart. It's not far, maybe 11 inches, but it feels like a lifetime. I keep wondering if someone will ever be brave enough to cross it." Clara's expression softened, caught somewhere between amusement and empathy. "That's a long way to travel," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe," he murmured, eyes locked on hers. "But something tells me you'd know the way." For a brief second, the world outside didn't exist. No rain, no city, no headlines. Only two people surrounded by words, both realizing that sometimes the quietest places hold the loudest beginnings. And as the clock struck 6, echoing softly through the marble halls, Rowan Hale, a man used to commanding rooms, found himself standing perfectly still, afraid that if he moved, the moment would disappear. He didn't yet know her name. But he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't walking out of that library unchanged. Rowan Hale returned to the old university library the next day, and then the day after that. He told himself it was for the peace, the quiet, the smell of old books that reminded him the world could still stand still for a while. But deep down, he knew it wasn't the silence that drew him back. It was her. Each time he came, Clara Monroe was there, sometimes standing on the ladder, dusting the upper shelves, sometimes sitting at the front desk, glasses slipping down her nose as she lost herself in a book. She didn't notice him at first, not really. To her, he was just another visitor hiding from the rain. But over the weeks, his coincidences became routine, and routine became something dangerously close to longing. The second time they spoke, she teased him for haunting the philosophy section. He smiled, saying, "It's safer than therapy." She laughed, and that sound did something strange to him, a warmth spreading through the cold edges of his chest. They began talking in small fragments, like puzzle pieces that didn't seem to belong together but somehow fit. He discovered she loved Camus and Kierkegaard. She discovered he secretly wrote poetry once, before the world demanded he trade words for numbers. They debated the nature of happiness, and she argued that peace mattered more than success. He told her he wasn't sure he knew the difference anymore. It wasn't flirtation, not yet. It was something slower, quieter, building beneath their words. Rowan began showing up with coffee. Always black for him, hazelnut for her. Sometimes he'd find her humming to herself as she rearranged the shelves. "You always hum the same tune," he once said. "It's from an old movie," she replied, smiling softly. "One where people fall in love but never end up together." He looked at her then, a little too long. Maybe that's because they never tried hard enough. She didn't answer, but he saw the faint color rise in her cheeks. Days turned into weeks. Their conversations stretched beyond books, into childhood memories, the fear of losing people, the fragile nature of trust. Clara listened more than she spoke, but Rowan found himself telling her things he hadn't said aloud in years. About his parents' divorce, about how every success felt like another layer of armor he didn't remember putting on. She didn't try to fix him. She just heard him. That was new and dangerous. Clara, too, found herself waiting for his visits. She told herself it was curiosity, nothing more. There was something about him she couldn't name. His calmness, his quiet authority, the way he looked at her as if she wasn't invisible. She noticed the subtle confidence in his movements, the expensive cut of his suits, the way people sometimes turned their heads when he entered. He didn't belong to her world, and yet in that library, it felt like he did. It wasn't until one late afternoon that the truth slipped out. She had stayed after hours to close up, the rain tapping gently on the glass. Rowan was still there, reading in his usual corner. She brought him his coat and smiled. "You know, you've been coming here for almost a month. Should I start charging you rent?" He chuckled, setting his book aside. "You could, though I'm not sure you'd need it." Her brow furrowed slightly. "Why's that?" He hesitated, just long enough for her curiosity to bloom. "Because you probably already have a library named after you. she joked, half teasing. He exhaled through a smile, but his eyes said otherwise. Something like that. That night after he left, she finally looked him up. Rowan Hale, CEO of Hale Dynamics, one of the largest tech corporations on the West Coast. The image on her screen looked nothing like the man who lingered in the quiet corners of her library. This version of him wore sharp tuxedos, shook hands with politicians, and smiled the kind of smile people rehearse for cameras. Her stomach turned cold. Of course he wasn't just anyone. Of course there was a reason he carried that kind of stillness, the kind that came from standing above the world too long. Suddenly, the simplicity of their friendship felt fragile, like glass stretched too thin. She imagined what people would say if they saw them together, what he must see when he looked at her. A small-town girl still hiding behind books, while his life played out in boardrooms and luxury penthouses. The next time he came, she was distant. Polite but distant. Rowan noticed immediately. "Did I do something?" he asked gently. "No," she said too quickly, her voice betraying the tremor in her chest. "I just think, maybe we're from different worlds." He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he took a slow step closer. "Different worlds," he repeated. "Maybe, but that doesn't mean they can't touch." She shook her head. "You don't understand. People like you," he stopped her, voice suddenly softer. "Clara, people like me spend our whole lives surrounded by noise. Meetings, deals, faces that forget yours the moment you leave the room. I thought I had everything. But then I realized..." He paused, his gaze steady on hers. "Money doesn't make me less lonely, but you might." The words hung between them, fragile and unguarded. Clara felt her throat tighten, her pulse quicken. No one had ever spoken to her like that. Not as a line, not as a promise, but as truth. For a second, she wanted to believe him, but belief was dangerous. She turned away, pretending to rearrange a stack of books. "You shouldn't say things like that." "Why not?" he asked. "Because it makes it harder to forget you when you stop coming." He said nothing, only watched her with an ache he didn't try to hide. The rain began again outside, a low hum that filled the silence between them. Finally, he whispered, "Then I guess I'll just have to keep coming back." Clara closed her eyes, not daring to turn around. The sound of his footsteps fading down the marble hall should have brought relief. Instead, it left her standing in the dim light, surrounded by stories, and realizing she was already living one she couldn't control. Rowan invited Clara to the gallery without calling it a date, at least not in words. He framed it as an opportunity to see something that reminded him of their conversations. An exhibition his company had quietly sponsored. A series titled The Distance Between Us that explored intimacy and absence through paint and light. Clara hesitated for a practical heartbeat, thinking of closing shifts and overdue returns, but curiosity and an unnameable pull won. When she arrived that evening, the rain had softened to a hush, and the gallery smelled faintly of oil and old varnish. Candlelight pooled on pedestals. The music was classical, slow and attentive, like a hand on the back of the neck. Rowan met her at the door in a sweater that made his shoulders look softer than suits did, and for the first time she saw him without the armor of formality. He greeted her simply, no cameras, no speeches, and led her into a room that seemed designed for them alone. The centerpiece was a large canvas, split with a deliberate seam, one side a cool, abstract geometry of blue and ash, the other a warmer wash of ochre and red. The title plaque read, "The Distance Between Us." They stood before it, the painting's silence matching their own. Rowan watched Clara more than the art, noticing the way her eyes narrowed as if reading a sentence written in brushstrokes. She turned to him and, without ceremony, said, "It feels like two people who almost touch." He answered softer than she expected, "Or two people who haven't tried hard enough." The exchange was small and ordinary, but it held a charge. He reached for her hand once, then withdrew, as if asking permission from a truth neither of them had named yet. Later, tucked into a low corner with wine and a small plate of shared olives, the conversation deepened. They traded stories that weren't performances, but confessions. The hollow applause of his public victories, the afternoon she spent reshelving a weathered book because its owner never returned. He talked about a childhood where silence became a currency, and success felt like a substitute for feeling. She told him about her mother's small bookstore, how it had closed when she was 19 and taught her that love sometimes lived in loss. When Rowan listened, he listened like someone learning a language he'd forgotten he once knew. His questions were careful, never invasive. His responses were honest, uncluttered by PR scripts or polite deflection. After the gallery, their dates grew into a quietly luminous routine that felt distinctly theirs. Weekends became foraging missions, finding a farmer's market where a vendor handed Clara a sprig of lavender, and Rowan paid with a distracted smile. Afternoon coffees stretched into long, unplanned dinners at a tiny Italian place with cracked leather booths, where the waitress remembered Clara's order before she did. One night they climbed to the roof of Rowan's building and lay on a blanket, shoulder to shoulder, watching satellites drift like distant promises across a thin city sky. In these ordinary scenes, their intimacy deepened the way water wears soft stone. Unhurried, inevitable. What changed most was not grand gestures, but the small dissolutions of distance. Clara taught Rowan how to slow down, how to notice the crack in a book's spine, how to savor a sentence without scrolling for the next one. She, in turn, learned to let someone hold her in a way that didn't demand performance. There were moments of delicious, careful closeness. Rowan's hand finding the small of her back as they navigated crowded streets. The brush of his fingertips against her wrist that made her breath hitch for the briefest second. The kisses they traded were rarely dramatic. Mostly, they arrived like punctuation marks in conversations, sealing a thought or softening a confession. And yet when they did deepen, a slow, measured press against lips in the half-light. The world narrowed until all that remained was each other's breath and the steady beat of being witnessed. There were, of course, edges. Clara sometimes woke to a flicker of doubt. How did a woman who curated silence belong to a man whose life was built on ceaseless noise? Rowan wrestled with his own fears, the reflex to shield, the habit of compartmentalizing feelings into spreadsheets of pros and cons. Once, after a morning when a headline had mischaracterized him, Clara saw the old defensive flash in his eyes and surprised herself by speaking out. "You don't have to be perfect in public to be real with me in private." The words were simple, but they landed like a steadying hand. It was the kind of encouragement he had not allowed himself to receive. And in that moment his facade slipped enough for her to see the man beneath. As their lives folded together, intimacy took on new textures. Rowan's world of late-night strategy calls softened at dawn by the volume of Clara's favorite records. She introduced him to wind-up clocks and second-hand bookstores. He taught her to savor single-origin coffee rather than the convenience of instant strength. The differences that once felt like barriers became curiosities to explore. She found his complexity intoxicating rather than intimidating. He found her steadiness not a restraint but a harbor. The gap between head and heart, the 11 inches he had once named in jest and in confession, began to feel less like a permanent gulf and more like a bridge under construction. Each conversation, each shared silence, and each act of trust was a plank laid down. On a rainy night, not unlike the one that had brought them together, Rowan and Clara paused on the library steps. The lamps threw halos onto wet stone. He reached for her hand, and this time did not hesitate. "I didn't know if I could cross it," he said, voice low and honest. "But I keep finding reasons to try." Her fingers curled around his, answering without words. In the wash of streetlight and rain, the distance between them felt less and less absolute. Not erased entirely, but carefully, tenderly diminished. It was not a tidy erasure. It was a process. But for the first time in a long time, neither of them feared the possibility of landing somewhere real. The calm they had been building felt fragile, like a paper boat on a swollen river. When the first article appeared, it landed like a stone. A tech rival, Nathan Cole, had planted a story with a tabloid. A splashy headline accusing Rowan Hale of using his relationship with a young librarian to camouflage illegal deals, a narrative designed to provoke outrage and distract from a hostile takeover bid. The piece was thin on facts and heavy on insinuation. It included grainy photos of Clara in public places and suggested motives where none existed. Within hours, the story metastasized. Blogs copied it. Aggregators amplified it. A chorus of judgment swelled with fierce efficiency. Clara saw the first tweet before Rowan called. She was shelving returns, the thin paper slip of library receipts dusting her hands, when her phone lit with 100 messages. At first she thought it was a mistake. Then the camera feeds arrived. Paparazzi clustered outside her building, lenses glinting like a ring of predatory insects. Her breath hitched as the reality of exposure slammed into her life. The little sanctuary of her routines became a spectacle overnight. The library felt suddenly public, its hush no match for the noise that had come for her. Panic came first, a hot, animal sensation, followed by a brittle, icy shame. Rowan moved faster than she expected. He called drivers, legal teams, publicists. His voice on the phone was a clinical machine of instructions. He told her to stay inside, to let him handle it, that he would make the lawyers issue statements, and the PR team would correct the record. He wanted to shield her, to fold her into a protected space where his resources could blink the problem away. But the way he executed protection, through immaculate silence and strategic press releases, felt to Clara like distance rather than defense. She wanted words that belonged to her, not crafted statements that sounded like someone else speaking in her name. She needed his voice in the small human places, not only the corporate memos. The first time she confronted him, she did it in the foyer of her building, while his security detail hovered 2 steps behind him. He wore a suit that made him look composure incarnate, and when he reached for her hand, she flinched away. "You should have told me before the cameras did," she said, the accusation raw. "I found the pictures alone. I had to hear strangers call me a thing I'm not." His expression was guarded. He placed both gloved hands on her shoulders as if to steady her. "I handled it. We're containing the fallout. The lawyers are—" She cut him off. "Containment," she repeated, tasting the word as if it were ash. "That's your solution for everything. You can contain crises, Rowan. You can't contain people's pain. You can call the right people. But you can't say the truth to me while you hide behind statements." The publicist's statement that night labeled the rumors as unfounded and praised Rowan's privacy. It was clean, efficient, and devoid of warmth. Clara read it and felt cleaner too, but also emptier, as though the thing she needed most was a voice that sounded like his own. Rowan didn't understand at first why she pulled back. In his calculus, speed and discretion were the kindest options. He assumed that by protecting her image, he protected her life. But the silence he cultivated to keep the story from inflaming further only widened the space between them. He could not fathom that protection, when delivered impersonally, could feel like erasure. Each prepared quote, each lawyer's letter, sat between them like glass. Clara, who had once found solace in quiet, now felt suffocated by scripted quiet, a silence manufactured by others and passed off as intimacy. The crescendo came when a camera followed Clara into the grocery store 2 days later. She fled to the back room of her apartment and called him with fingers that shook. "They're outside my building," she whispered. "They're saying things about me. I don't know what to do." He arrived within minutes, and for a heartbeat, the relief she felt at seeing him was genuine. He hugged her. She felt his heartbeat against her ear and for a moment let herself breathe. But then his phone buzzed. He checked it, stepped back, and spoke to his assistant in a tone that had nothing for the woman standing in front of him. "We need a statement. Draft 3 versions. Legal wants to prepare a cease and desist." He looked at her and apologized in a voice trained to soothe crises, not hearts. That was the fracture. "You can keep the whole world in check," Clara said, voice steady despite the tremor beneath. "But you cannot keep me if you do not speak to me. If you do not tell me the truth yourself." The words landed between them like an ultimatum, sharp, unavoidable. Rowan reached for her as if to close the distance, but she stepped back, gathering the libraries of all her unspoken fears and stacking them like a shield. "I need you to be real with me," she whispered. "Not flawless in the papers, but real in front of me." They broke then, not with a shout, but with the heavy silence of 2 people leaving rooms they once shared. Rowan watched her walk away, each step brittle as turned pages. He called that night, the next morning, and for a week after, messages left like small, thoughtful offerings. She replied once, saying simply that she needed time and space to remember who she was without the constant glare. Rowan, who had always been able to negotiate terms, deadlines, and hostile bids, found himself ill-equipped to bargain for a heart. The story in the press cooled in cycles, but the damage had been done. The orchestrated defenses, the polished denials, the legal victories, none reached the place he most wanted to save. Clara's retreat was not an escape, but a recalibration, a way to protect herself from being rewritten by a world that loved tidy narratives. For Rowan, the lesson was raw and humbling. He could command markets, but he could not command the truth to mean anything to the person he loved unless he first said it plainly and without filter. To her, not to the cameras. Months rearranged themselves into a new rhythm. Rain, board meetings, quiet mornings, and life settled into an altered pattern for both of them. For Rowan, the public war had a price. The hostile bid that Nathan Cole had engineered retreated only after Rowan conceded part of his stake and reshaped his leadership team. He lost percentage points and prestige in spreadsheets, but he gained something harder to quantify: perspective. The legal victories and media corrections had sealed the company's survival, yet every negotiation felt dimmer afterward, like a theater curtain lowered on a play he no longer wanted to star in. He found himself choosing less spectacle and more substance, listening at meetings instead of ordering, asking questions he used to answer. It was small, almost imperceptible, but those who worked with him noticed a quieter edge to his authority. Less performance, more attention. Clara's life shifted in parallel, though not identically. She left the library with a sense of necessity rather than defeat, taking a position at a modest art museum on the other side of town. The change was practical, steadier hours, a chance to curate rather than shelve, but it became something else entirely, a reclamation. Among canvases and archival boxes, she discovered a new way to be useful, to place objects and stories into contexts that made sense. She handled fragile paper and old paint with the same reverence she had shown books, and in that careful tending she found a steadying solace. The museum's quiet corridors were different from the library's hush, but they had their own music, the careful footfalls of conservators, the hum of climate control, the soft authority of labels being written. It suited her. It allowed her to breathe without having to defend the way she breathed. Between their separate routines stretched a distance that felt both physical and emotional. Rowan filled his days with work and his nights with a private ritual. He composed emails to Clara every day. They were never short. Some mornings he wrote long pages, recollections of moments only the two of them would remember, a joke about a misfiled book, the way rain had sounded the first time they met. Other drafts read like apologies, carefully parsed and honest, admitting how his instinct to protect had become a means of hiding. Sometimes he wrote letters that were simply banal, a description of a sunset, a recipe for coffee she might like. He never sent them. Each unsent email collected like paper butterflies in a folder titled Unsure. He told himself he respected her need for space. He told himself it was nobler to wait. Pride, embarrassment, and the nagging fear of intruding into a life she had chosen without him conspired to keep his cursor blinking. Clara found her own quiet coping mechanisms. She began keeping a small notebook of things she wanted to remember, not to tally them like evidence, but to honor them. A line scribbled on a Tuesday. Rowan laughed at the way I mispronounced Kierkegaard. He thought it was charming. Another entry. The lavender vendor smiled and called me by name. I forgot about the cameras for an hour. She pressed small things into the pages. A ticket stub from an exhibit, a dried lavender sprig, a napkin with a hurried coffee stain. These artifacts became less about holding on to him, and more about preserving the version of herself who could still notice small mercies. Their lives continued in parallel lines that sometimes ran close enough for echoes. Rowan would pass by a window at Hale Dynamics and watch rain streak the glass, thinking of the way Clara had once traced a waterline with her thumb. Clara would stand before an impressionist seascape and feel, without wanting to, the ache of being seen. They both experienced the peculiar intimacy of absent affection, the knowledge that someone else was keeping a ledger of memory in his or her head, even if they no longer shared a room. Friends and coworkers filled the empty spaces with questions they meant to help, but often did not. "Have you spoken?" became a gentle refrain, a test they both failed and passed in private. Rowan replied to inquiries with guarded honesty, admitting mistakes in a way that shocked his board but felt honest to him. Clara smiled politely when her new colleagues mentioned that scandal, and then steered conversations toward curatorial plans. Neither wanted pity. Both wanted repair, not of reputation, but of the small, human scaffolding that had supported their connection. Time, with its unhurried insistence, did something subtle. It softened edges without erasing the contours of loss. The emails in Rowan's drafts folder accumulated, unsent but not forgotten, each one a small gravity pulling at his days. Meanwhile, Clara's notebook grew thicker, a private archive of ordinary moments that mattered enough to be recorded. They were both living proofs that absence could be a presence, a shaping force that altered choices and nudged behavior, sometimes toward humility, sometimes toward stubborn withdrawal. Months after the fallout, on a gray morning that felt like many before it, Rowan found himself standing outside the museum. He hadn't planned to come. He told his assistant it was an errand. He told himself it was curiosity. The building's facade looked smaller than the brochures had promised, but the light inside was honest. He didn't go in. He stood beneath the awning and watched a woman, not Clara, but another curator, let a student through the door, and something in him tightened and eased at once. He pressed his palm against the glass as if measuring the temperature of a life he might one day cross again. Then he walked away, leaving tracks in wet pavement that the rain smudged immediately. Like an apology no one had yet accepted, the gap between them remained, not a chasm of hatred but an expanse shaped by time, choices, and unspoken regret. It was a distance neither had planned to map, but both had learned to navigate. And in the quiet places of their separate days, each held a small, private question. If the other were brave enough to cross, would the bridge still be there to meet them? A year had a way of folding itself around memory until only meaningful dates remained. Anniversaries without intention, landmarks of what had been and what might still become. The cultural fundraiser in Portland felt like one of those landmarks. An elegant, understated evening meant to raise money for community reading programs, held in the very library where Clara and Rowan had first met. The organizers had chosen the space deliberately, arguing that nothing reminded donors of the power of stories like bookshelves full of quiet witnesses. For Clara, the invitation was practical. She volunteered occasionally now, keeping a polite distance from charity boards. For Rowan, the decision to attend was far less practical and far more urgent. He stood beneath the library's glass canopy before the event properly began. Rain slicked stones turning the plaza into a mirror for the city's lights. He had rehearsed what he would say for months in his head. Not corporate language, not prepared remarks, but truth stripped of spin. The evening around him swelled with conversation and laughter, glasses chiming, but those noises felt peripheral. The real sound for him was the slow beat of his own resolve. When he saw her move through the crowd, cataloging donors with a gentle efficiency, something tightened in his chest. Clara looked the same and changed all at once. Her hair pinned differently, a soft dress that trusted the shape of her, hands that moved with deliberate calm. For a moment he simply watched, memorizing gestures he had already known, as if he could make up for lost time by learning them twice. Rowan didn't wait for a quiet corner. He walked to the center of the main reading room, as if the library itself had cleared a path for him. He asked for the microphone in a voice that was steady but not rehearsed, and the room shifted its attention. He didn't give a speech about philanthropy or culture. He paused long enough for the silence to thicken, then spoke in the kind of plain sentences that landed harder than any crafted line. "A year ago," he began, "someone taught me that the bravest thing you can do is risk being vulnerable in a place that can commodify everything. I spent months fixing what I thought I had to fix. Spreadsheets, stock, statements. And in the process, I learned how much I had been protecting things that didn't matter as much as the truth." He turned and his eyes found Clara, steady and direct. "The distance between my head and my heart," he said, "is something I named once in a line that sounded clever. It was 11 inches, or it was symbolic. But tonight, I want to say it plainly. The only reason I haven't been whole is because I was afraid to be brave enough to cross that distance. Tonight, I have decided otherwise. The room watched, some with curiosity, some with skepticism born of social rituals. Clara felt the air shift around her in a way that made it hard to breathe. Rowan stepped down from the dais and moved toward her, as if everyone else had become background noise. He stopped directly in front of her, his hand finding hers without ceremony. He reached into his jacket and produced a small box that seemed almost ordinary against the library's grandeur. It opened to reveal a simple ring, a thin band with a small, well-cut stone, modest enough to be personal and not performative. "When I thought about how to show you my intention," Rowan said, voice raw in a way that surprised even him, "I realized a ring shouldn't be for anyone else's eyes. It should remind you of the choices I am asking you to make with me, not what I promised to buy for you. Clara Monroe, will you marry me?" The words were quiet but carried the weight of months, of unsent emails, of drafts that had sat in folders titled unsure, of apologies that finally stopped sounding like press releases. Clara's world constricted to the warmth of his hand, to the small box that had made the room hold its breath. Tears came without announcement, clean and hot, blurring the shelves into watercolor. She thought of the months she had spent rebuilding herself in galleries and climate-controlled halls, of the nights she had cataloged regret into a notebook, of how she had practiced indifference like a shield. All of that felt suddenly unnecessary in the presence of a man who had chosen transparency over control. She squeezed his hand, the grip an answer before words could form. "Rowan," she said, voice breaking but steady. "I never left this place. I never left the part of me that believed in stories that end in more than silence." She lifted her chin and smiled through the tears. "I'm here. I never went anywhere." The phrase was both a reassurance and a promise. She reached for the box, and when he slid the ring onto her finger, it fit like an alignment of small truths finding one another. Around them, conversation resumed slowly, like a tide pulling back into the theater of ordinary life. People clapped, some with genuine delight, others with the habit of applauding what society expected. Clara and Rowan remained in the center of it all, hands intertwined, the simple ring catching light from the high windows. The distance between them had not vanished. Bridges are rarely instantaneous. But in that moment it had been acknowledged, crossed, and pledged into being with humility rather than spectacle. They stayed on the steps long after the guests drifted away, watching rain patterns stitch across the plaza. Rowan rested his forehead against hers and said, "Half to the night, half to the future. Thank you for waiting." Clara cupped his face and whispered back, "I didn't, I was right here." In the quiet that followed, two people who had learned the cost of silence let courage lead the next page of their story. Months after the proposal, Clara and Rowan turned what began as a private reconciliation into something that belonged to the city. They launched the Distance Project, a modest foundation with a clear mission: bring books, mentors, and reading spaces to teenagers who rarely saw themselves reflected in printed pages. The announcement wasn't a press stunt. It was the logical next step for two people who had found each other amid margins and footnotes. Clara led the curatorial side, selecting titles, designing workshops, choosing authors whose voices could widen a young reader's sense of possibility, while Rowan used his resources to fund mobile libraries, free subscriptions for school programs, and small grants for neighborhood reading rooms. Their partnership was practical and deliberate. She guarded the program's integrity. He provided the infrastructure to make it sustainable. The first outreach was quiet and intimate, a refurbished book truck, painted in soft blues, and the foundation's name rolling into neighborhoods where libraries had closed. Teenagers clustered around like moths to a new light, hesitant at first, then laughing as volunteers handed out bookmarks and recommended first reads. Clara taught the kids how to choose a book by its opening line. Rowan read aloud in a tone he never used in boardrooms, surprised at how quickly strangers leaned forward at the sound of his voice. Those afternoons became rituals, a weekday kind of joy that grounded both of them. It was in these smaller, repeated gestures that the real work of mending happened, not through headlines, but through steady presence. On a rain-sheened evening nearly a year later, They stood together on the library's balcony, the same place where their story had first blurred into possibility. The city stretched out below, lights softened by the mist. The sound of rain threaded through the lamplight, familiar and cleansing. Rowan wrapped an arm around Clara's shoulders, and she leaned in without resistance. They watched the droplets stitch the pavement into silver and listened to the soft chorus of a city that had taught them how to be human again. No words were needed at first, only the shared breath of two people who had learned to translate bravery into daily gentleness. When the narrator's voice returned, soft, steady, the kind that had introduced listeners to their story, it offered a final thought that felt both universal and intimate. There are distances you cannot measure by inches or miles. They are bridged only by the work of trust, the slow building of everyday courage, and ultimately by love. The rain kept falling, and beneath it, two people who had once been separated by their own fears chose, every day, to cross the space between them. Thank you so much for listening to The Distance We Can't Name. If this story touched your heart, even just a little, please don't forget to hit that like button, leave a comment to share your thoughts, and subscribe to Veil of Hearts for more stories about love, loss, and the quiet courage it takes to find your way back. Every click, every comment, every bit of support helps this little corner of storytelling grow and means the world to me. Until next time. Keep your heart open and remember, sometimes the smallest distance between two souls is just one honest word.